kicked out on her 18th birthday with $300 in 2 garbage bags, an orphaned girl inherited a dead man's blacksmith shop in a town the world had already forgotten. What she found buried beneath that anvil would tear the lid off a secret 11 years in the making and put her own life in the crosshairs. And if you've ever felt like the world made up its mind about you before you ever got a say, like you were just a name in a file, a case number somebody else's problem, then stay with me. Because this story is for you. It's for every one of us who got handed a key to a door we never knew existed and had to decide all alone whether we had the nerve to open it. Her name was Marlo Ash. For 10 years, the state called her a ward of the court. The man who left her that shop, a grandfather she believed had thrown her family away, called her something else entirely. He just never got the chance to say it to her face. What he left behind in that cold, dust-choked forge would change everything. So light the fire with me. Let's begin. The day Marlo Ash turned 18 was the day the state of Pennsylvania stopped having to remember she existed. For 10 years, she had been a file, a folder in a cabinet, a line in a budget that someone in an office she had never seen signed off on twice a year. Marlo Ash, ward of the court. That was who she was on paper. That was who she was to the men and women who decided where she slept and what she ate and how much of her own life she was allowed to have. And now, on a cold, gray morning in the first week of March, that folder was being closed for good. She stood on the cracked concrete steps of the Briarwood Home for Youth with 2 black garbage bags slung over her shoulder, and that was everything. 18 years of living, and it all fit into 2 bags she could carry in one hand. There had been no cake. There had been no song. No one had hung a banner or lit a candle or told her to make a wish. There had only been Mr. Cruz, the house supervisor, a heavy man with tired eyes and a permanent frown, who handed her a thin manila envelope across his desk without quite looking at her. Inside that envelope was her birth certificate, her social security card, and $300 in cash. A transitional stipend, they called it. The state's parting gift. Enough for a deposit on a room somewhere if she was careful. Enough to last a week if she was not. "Good luck out there, Ash," Mr. Cruz had said, and even as he said it, his eyes were already drifting down to the next file on his desk. The next name. The next problem that wasn't hers anymore. The door clicked shut behind her. It was a small sound. A latch. A piece of metal sliding into a piece of metal. But standing out there on those steps in that thin March light that gave off no warmth at all, Marlo heard it like the slam of a vault. Final. Complete. The closing of a door she would never walk back through, into a place that had never once felt like home, but had at least been a roof. She was free now. For the first time in her life, she belonged to no one and nothing. No curfew, no bed check, no supervisor. And freedom she was learning in that exact moment felt an awful lot like being shoved off the edge of a cliff and told to figure out how to fly on the way down. She had no family to call. There was no one. Her parents had died when she was 7, and after that, there had only been the system, the homes, the case files, the strangers who came and went. She had no friends on the outside who weren't in the same sinking boat she was. The few kids she'd grown close to over the years had aged out before her, scattered to motels and couches and worse. And most of them she never heard from again. She was an island, and the tide was coming in fast, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She shifted the bags higher on her shoulder, turned up the collar of a coat that wasn't warm enough, and started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks down. The plan, if you could call it a plan, was to find the cheapest motel in the city, pay for 1 night, and use whatever was left of that $300 to keep her heart beating long enough to think of a better one. She had made it half a block when the car pulled up beside her. It was a beat-up sedan, the color of dishwater, and Marlowe knew it before the window even came down, because she knew the woman driving it. Ms. Hale, her caseworker. A thin, worn woman who always seemed to be running on cold coffee and frayed nerves, who carried too many files and not enough time, but whose eyes, and this was the thing that had always surprised Marlowe, whose eyes still held a flicker of something real, something that hadn't gone numb yet. Concern. Maybe even something close to caring. "Marlowe," Ms. Hale said through the open window, and there was a breathlessness in her voice like she'd been driving fast. "Thank God, I caught you." She leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. "Get in. Something's come up." And Marlowe's stomach dropped straight through the sidewalk. Because in her world, in the world of the file and the folder and the line in the budget, something's come up was never, ever good. It meant a paperwork error, a lost form, a check that hadn't cleared. It meant the universe had found one more crack to drop you through. In 18 years, she had never once heard those words and had something good follow them. But she got in. Because where else was she going to go? The car smelled like stale coffee and old paper and the cardboard pine tree hanging from the mirror that had stopped smelling like anything years ago. Miss Hale pulled back into traffic and drove for a while without saying a word, her hands tight on the wheel, her brow folded into a knot. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. "The way you speak when you're holding something fragile and you're afraid of dropping it." "I was finishing your discharge file this morning," she said. "There's a cross-check we have to run when a ward ages out. We pull the probate records. Death records, wills, anything filed against your family name. It's routine. We're just making sure there's no outstanding claim, no debt, no inheritance hanging out there that the state needs to account for." She paused. "Usually it's nothing, a forgotten savings bond. $50 in an account somebody closed 20 years ago." She took a breath, and Marlowe watched her hands tighten on the wheel. "Marlowe, it wasn't nothing. Marlowe stared out the window at the gray city sliding by the brick and the wire and the boarded-up storefronts, and she didn't say anything because the word inheritance was not a word that lived in her vocabulary. It was a word for other people, people with families, people with last names that meant something. "My parents had nothing," she said finally. Her voice came out flat. "That's how I ended up here. They died with nothing." "It's not your parents," Ms. Hale said quietly. "It's your grandfather." And Marlowe turned and looked at her. Because she had a grandfather only in the way you have a character in a story someone read to you once. A name in a file. Silas Ash. Her father's father. A man who, according to every record the state had ever shown her, had cut himself loose from his own son and his own family long before Marlowe was ever born. A man who she had been told her whole life had wanted nothing to do with any of them. A ghost. That's all he had ever been. A ghost with a name. "Silas Ash," Ms. Hale said, as if reading her mind. "He passed away about 5 months ago." And something happened in Marlowe's chest that she did not expect. A small, hollow pang. A door she didn't know was there opening onto an empty room. Grief for a stranger. Grief for a man she had never met, never spoken to, never seen. It made no sense. And yet there it was. "Okay," she said softly. "So he died. What does that have to do with me?" Miss Hale slowed the car and pulled it over to the curb. She put it in park, and she turned in her seat to face Marlowe fully. And from the seat beside her, she lifted a large, stiff envelope. It was old. The paper had gone the color of weak tea at the edges, the way paper does when it has waited a very long time for someone. On the front, in a spidery, slanting hand that Marlowe had never seen before in her life, was written one word. Marlowe. "He had a will," Miss Hale said. "An old one, but it was airtight, properly witnessed, properly filed, and he left everything he had to you." Marlowe took the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be, and she realized holding it that no one had ever written her name like that. Not on a form, not on a folder, like it mattered, like the hand that wrote it had slowed down to do it right. "Everything," she repeated. The word felt foreign in her mouth. "What's everything?" "A property," Miss Hale said. "About 3 hours north of here. A town called Stonebridge." She hesitated. The legal description calls it a commercial property with an attached residential unit. She looked at Marlowe, and there was something almost apologetic in her face. "It's a blacksmith shop, Marlowe." The words landed in the car and just hung there, absurd, impossible, like something out of a book about 100 years ago. A blacksmith shop. Marlowe pictured fire and an anvil and a bearded man in a leather apron, and none of it had anything at all to do with her life or anyone she had ever known. "He left you this too," Ms. Hale said. and she placed in Marlowe's open hand a small, heavy object wrapped in a square of oilcloth. Marlowe peeled back the cloth. It was a key. An old iron key, the kind you'd see in a museum, long and dark and cold, with a handle shaped like a twisting vine and teeth like nothing she'd ever put in a modern lock. It was heavy, heavier than a key had any right to be. It sat in her palm like a stone, like something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time to be held again.
"There's something else you should know," Ms. Hale said, and her voice changed. It got careful again. "The estate has a lawyer, a man named Marcus Vane. He's been trying to track you down for months. He represents a development group, Pierce Development. They want the property, and they've made an offer."
She drew a second envelope from her bag. This one was crisp and new and white, the way money is always white and clean. She slid out a single sheet, an offer letter formal, and typed, and she handed it across. Marlowe's eyes ran down the page and stopped at the number printed at the bottom. $75,000. She stopped breathing. To a girl with $300 and 2 garbage bags to her name, $75,000 was not a number. It was a different planet. It was a life raft thrown to someone going under for the 3rd time. It was a deposit on an apartment and a used car, and a year of community college and food in the refrigerator, and the right to sleep at night without the cold animal fear of the street pressing against her ribs.
It was an escape hatch out of the exact future she had spent her whole life watching come for her. "They want an answer by the end of the month," Ms. Hale said gently. "Vane said the town's being revitalized. His people are buying up the whole old downtown block. Your grandfather's shop is the last piece they don't have." Marlowe sat there with the offer letter in one hand and the old iron key in the other, and she looked back and forth between them. One was clean, typed, easy, a way out. The other was cold and heavy and impossible, and it felt. And she could not have explained this to Ms. Hale or to anyone. It felt like a question being asked by a man she had never met, a ghost reaching out of the ground.
Why, that was the question. Why would a man who supposedly threw his family away leave his last possession on earth to a granddaughter he had never once come to see? Why a blacksmith shop? Why write her name like it mattered on an envelope after a lifetime of silence? I have to go there, Marlowe said. The words were out of her mouth before she had even decided to say them.
Ms. Hale looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly, and the saddest, smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I thought you might say that," she said. She reached into her bag again and brought out a folded slip of paper. "A bus ticket. It leaves in an hour." Marlowe took it. "Marlowe!" Ms. Hale put a hand on her arm, and it was the first time Marlowe could remember the woman ever touching her. "Be careful up there. A place that's been shut up and empty a long time. It holds more than dust. You understand me? More than dust." Marlo didn't understand. Not yet, but she would. The bus pulled out of the city station an hour later, and Marlo watched through the smeared window as the world she knew slowly drained away behind her. It happened in stages. The gray towers and the chain link and the highway overpasses gave way to suburbs' ranks of small houses pressed close together. The suburbs thinned into strip malls and gas stations, and then into long stretches of nothing-wide brown fields, stitched together with sagging wire fence, stripped bare and waiting for spring. The sky, which in the city had only ever been a slot of light between buildings, opened up over her until it was enormous, low and gray and endless, and the bus felt small underneath it. She watched the power lines dip and rise between the poles, and she felt with each mile like she was traveling backward in time, away from the present into something older. The other passengers were quiet. A few tired faces, a man asleep against the glass, an old woman with a paper sack of groceries on her lap. No one spoke. No one looked at anyone. Marlo kept her hand in her coat pocket the entire way, her fingers wrapped around the cold iron of the key. It was the only solid thing in a day that had turned the whole world upside down, and she held it the way a drowning person holds a piece of wood. 3 hours later, the bus hissed to a stop in front of a boarded-up gas station, and the driver called out, "Stonebridge," and Marlo realized he was talking to her because she was the only one getting off. She stepped down onto the cracked asphalt, and the doors folded shut behind her, and the bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel. And then it was gone, and there was only silence. Stonebridge wasn't so much a town as the memory of one. The main street ran wide and cracked between 2 rows of 2-story brick buildings, and half of them were dead. Windows papered over from the inside, or staring out, blank and empty, like the eyes of something that had stopped seeing. A faded barber pole that didn't turn. A diner with a closed sign so old the paper had curled. A single traffic light hung over an empty intersection, blinking a slow, patient yellow over and over at no one. There were no cars. There were no people. There was only the wind moving down the street, and somewhere a loose sign creaking on its chain. The air smelled of wet earth and rust, and something underneath it all that Marlo couldn't name. The smell of a place that had given up. She had the address from Vane's letter, 114 Forge Road, and she didn't need a map for that because she could see the street sign a block down, and she could see even from here that the buildings ran out at the end of it, where the pavement turned to gravel, and then to dirt, and then to the dark line of woods crowding in behind the town. She slung her bags higher and started walking. Her footsteps echoed off the dead storefronts. And as she walked, she felt its eyes. A curtain twitched in the window of a corner store, the one building on the whole street that looked like it might still be open, a single bare bulb burning behind the glass. She felt unseen faces watching her from the shadows of the empty town. The stranger, The girl with the garbage bags, walking into a place where everyone already knew everyone, and no one had ever heard of her.
Number 114 was the very last building on the block. It stood at the end of the line where the asphalt surrendered to dirt, the last building before the woods, and it stood. And there was no other word for it, defiant. Where the other buildings had slumped and sagged and given themselves over to ruin, this one stood square and solid against the gray sky, planted in the earth, like it had decided a long time ago that it was not going anywhere.
It was made of the same dark red brick as the others, but it was older, heavier. The ground floor was all business, a huge barn-style sliding door of wood, weathered silver gray, big enough to drive a wagon through, and beside it, a single grime-coated display window, so dirty you couldn't see in. The whole building wore its years like a hide. Weeds grew thick and high around the foundation. Paint peeled from the window frames in long curls like sunburned skin. It had the look of a thing that had been left alone for a long, long time. And above the sliding door on a faded wooden sign, she had to step back and squint to read, were the words, Ash and Sun. Forged metal. Marlowe stood in the dirt road and stared up at that sign, and the cold of the day reached all the way into her chest. Sun. Her father, because the man on that sign, the sun, was Daniel Ash, her dad. The man she could barely remember, a warmth and a voice and a pair of strong arms that had vanished from her life when she was 7 years old. He had been here. He had stood under this sign. His name was on it, weathered and faded, but still there joined to his father's by that small, ordinary, impossible word and word. Ash and Sun, together, a family. A thing she had never once in her life had a piece of standing right there in front of her, painted on a board above a door. Her heart gave a hard, painful lurch. The big sliding door she found was locked tight, not with a modern lock, but with a heavy iron hasp and a padlock, the size of her fist, rusted so solid she knew without touching it that no key was opening that today. The iron skeleton key in her pocket wasn't for this. There was a separate entrance she could see now around the side. A steep, narrow wooden staircase running up the outside of the building to the residential unit on the second floor, sheltered under a sagging little roof. She climbed it. Each board groaned under her weight, complaining like the whole town was complaining about being woken up. At the top, there was a small landing and a heavy wooden door, and the keyhole was set in a plate of ornate iron shaped like a twisting vine, the same vine she realized that formed the handle of the key in her pocket. Made to match, made by the same hand. She slid the key in. The lock was stiff, frozen by years of neglect. She had to lean into it, and for a second she thought it wouldn't turn at all. And then something deep inside the mechanism gave way.
and there was a heavy, satisfying clunk as the bolt drew back, a sound so loud in the silence that it seemed to echo down the empty street behind her. She pushed the door open, and a wave of cold, stale air rolled out over her, the breath of a place that had been holding it for a very long time. Dust, mothballs, old paper, and underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, something else. Something metallic and faintly smoky. The ghost of a fire that had gone out years ago. She stepped inside. The apartment was a tomb. Everything in it was covered in a thick, soft layer of gray dust, the kind that takes years to settle, and yet underneath that dust, everything was perfectly eerily in its place. As if the man who lived here had stood up from his chair one evening, walked out the door, and simply never come back. A small front room with a threadbare armchair facing a cold, dark fireplace. A galley kitchen with yellowed linoleum and a kettle still sitting on the stove. A narrow hall leading back into darkness. The weak afternoon light pushed through the grimy windows in dirty shafts. And in those shafts, the dust she had stirred up hung and turned slow like snow that had forgotten how to fall. Marlowe walked through it slowly, and she felt like she shouldn't be there. Like she was disturbing something sacred. She ran one finger along the dusty top of a side table and left a clean, dark streak. And the sight of it made her feel sick, like she had written graffiti across a grave.
In the back bedroom, the bed was made. That was the thing that got her. A simple iron-framed bed, neatly made of faded quilt, pulled up tight and square. The corners tucked, the pillow centered. A man who knew he was running out of days had still made his bed every morning. There was a small stack of books on the nightstand, and on the wall above the bed, hanging slightly crooked, was a single framed photograph. Marlowe crossed to it. She lifted her sleeve and wiped the dust from the glass. And then she went very still. It was a photograph of a young man and a young woman standing close together in the sunshine in front of this very building. Behind their heads, bright and freshly painted, was the sign: Ash and Sun. The young woman was beautiful, laughing head tilted back, her hand on the man's chest. And the young man had his arm around her and a look on his face of pure, uncomplicated pride. The pride of a man who has the woman he loves under one arm and the work of his hands at his back and wants for nothing else in the world. He looked like Marlowe. Or rather, she looked like him. The same dark brows, the same set of the jaw, the same eyes. It was her parents. Marlowe had exactly one other photograph of her mother and father in the entire world. A small, creased, faded wallet picture she had carried through 10 years and a dozen beds, worn so soft at the edges, their faces had nearly disappeared. She had taken it out 1,000 times in the dark, trying to remember, trying to hold on to two people
who got farther away every single year. But this was large and clear and sharp. Her mother's laugh, her father's pride, the light in their faces. They were so young. They were so alive. They were standing in front of a future they thought they had all the time in the world to live. And it had been waiting for her on a wall, in a dead man's bedroom, in a town 3 hours from everything she had ever known. A wave of grief hit her so hard and so fast that her knees went out from under her, and she sat down heavily on the edge of the dusty bed, the springs creaking under her, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. This wasn't a building. She understood that now, sitting there in the cold and the dust with her parents looking down at her from the wall. This was a story. It was her story, and she didn't know a single word of it. She sat there a long time as the light outside slid down toward evening, and the room grew darker and colder around her. And somewhere in that long, silent stretch of time, the $75,000 stopped feeling like a life raft and started feeling like something else. A betrayal. How could she sell this? How could she take a check from a stranger and hand over the only photograph she had of her parents' faces? Hand it over to men who would take a bulldozer to a story she had only just started to read. But the other voice was there too. It was always there. It had been forged into her over 10 years of the system, hard and practical and cold. Don't be a fool, it said. Sentiment doesn't pay rent. A photograph doesn't fix a roof. You have $300 and no skills and no family and a building that's falling down in a town that's already dead. Take the money. Take the money and run, and don't look back, because chances like this don't come twice in a life like yours. She needed to see the rest of it. The shop. That was the heart of the place. The part with the fire and the anvil, the part the sign was named for. There had to be a way down from the apartment to the work below. A blacksmith wouldn't have walked all the way around the building in the cold every morning. She found it tucked behind a door at the end of the hall that she'd taken for a closet. A steep, narrow set of wooden stairs heading down into solid darkness. She took out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and went down. The air changed as she descended. It got colder, denser. The dusty, lived-in smell of the apartment fell away behind her, and in its place came something older and sharper and entirely different. Cold iron, coal dust, oil. The faint sourness of old sweat soaked into wood and stone over decades. It was the smell of work. Hard, physical, ancient work. A man's whole life breathed out into the dark. The stairs ended at a heavy door with a simple iron latch. She lifted it. She pushed. And her little light swept out into an enormous darkness. The room was huge, far bigger than she had imagined from the street, the ceiling soaring up 2 full stories above her into shadow. Her flashlight cut a single narrow path through it,
And at the edges of that path, shapes loomed up out of the black and then sank back into it as she moved. In the center of it all, rising out of the packed dirt floor, was the forge. A great brooding structure of brick and stone, its hood gone coal black with the soot of 100,000 fires. And beside it, mounted on a massive stump of oak as wide as a barrel, was the anvil. She stopped when her light found it. It was a hulking thing of dark steel, scarred and dented, and worn smooth on its face by years and years of hammering a beast of a tool that looked like it weighed as much as she did. It sat there in the dark, patient, waiting as if it had simply been pausing between strikes for the last several years and was confident the hand would come back. Tools hung in silent ranks along the walls. Hammers of every size, from little ones she could have held in 2 fingers to great long-handled sledges. Tongs with long, elegant jaws. Chisels and punches and things she had no names for. All of them wore a fine red coat of rust dust, but they hung straight and ordered everyone in its place ready, as if the man who used them had stepped out for a moment and meant to be right back. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with half-finished pieces and lengths of scrap. A massive vise, big enough to hold a wagon axle, was bolted to one of them. In the far corner sat a hulking machine of belts and iron she would later learn was a power hammer, a great mechanical beast from another century. It was a cathedral. That was the only word for it. A cathedral of forgotten work, a temple to fire and iron, and she was standing in the middle of it, a girl in a thin coat with a phone for a candle, and she felt how small she was and how large the silence. She walked slowly through it, her light dancing over the tools, and she imagined the noise. The roar of the fire in that great black throat. The ring of the hammer on the anvil, clear and bright as a bell. The heat. She imagined her grandfather standing right here where she stood, his sleeves rolled, his arms strong, the orange light of the forge moving over his face. And beside him, smaller, a boy with wide eyes who was not afraid of the noise and not afraid of the heat. Her father. She moved to the main workbench, the one beneath the dirty front window, where what was left of the daylight made a faint gray smear on the floor. And there in the center of it, covered by a heavy canvas cloth, gone stiff with age, was a shape. She pulled the cloth away. It was a toolbox, but not the kind you buy in a store. This was handmade, a heavy box of steel and oak with hand-cut hinges and a latch worked into the shape of a leaf. The work of a craftsman made to last 100 years. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nested in fitted slots of dark leather, was a set of tools entirely different from the rough working hammers on the walls. These were small, fine, delicate, engraving tools and files and calipers, the instruments of careful, patient work. And beneath them, lying flat in a slot made just its size, was a journal, leather-bound, the cover worn soft and dark
with the oil of a hand that had held it many times.
Marlowe lifted it out, and her own hands were shaking, and she told herself it was the cold. She opened it to the first page, and there it was, again, the same spidery slanting hand from the envelope. Silas. She held the phone close, and she began to read, and the dead man's voice rose up out of the page and filled the dark around her. The first entry was dated more than 30 years ago, October. The boy walked into the shop today on his own 2 feet, no holding the bench, came straight at the fire. Most children cry at the noise of the hammer. This one laughed, not afraid of the heat, not afraid of the steel. He has the heart of a smith. My son, my hope. Marlowe lowered herself onto a dusty stool beside the workbench, the journal open on her knee, and she kept reading, and she could not stop. She read about her father's whole childhood spent in the orange light of this forge. His first time holding a hammer too heavy for his small hands, the entry said, but he wouldn't put it down. His first clumsy, hopeless attempts to shape hot steel, and the slow, year-by-year improvement recorded in a few short lines at a time. The entries were brief, practical. The man was no poet, but threaded through every one of them was a pride so deep and so fierce that it came up off the page and put a lump in Marlowe's throat. A father teaching his son the trade, the art, the mystery of fire and iron, passing down everything he knew, one entry at a time, one strike at a time, a legacy. And then, somewhere in the middle of the book, the tone began to change. The entries got shorter. They came farther apart. They spoke of her father growing older, growing restless. They spoke of the town beginning to die around them, the mill closing the shops, shutting one by one, the work drying up. Daniel says there's no future here. In the soot and the noise, he says the trade is dying. Maybe he's right. He's a young man, and the world is wide, and Stonebridge gets smaller every year. He had met a girl, Cora. They were in love. They wanted to go to the city where a man could build a different kind of life. And the entries grew thinner and sadder the way a fire gets thin before it goes out. The last entry was dated the year before Marlowe was born. He's leaving. Cora is going with him, and that's right. A man should follow the woman he loves. He says there's nothing for him here. Maybe there isn't. But what is a man without his trade? What is a father without his son? The sign will still say ash and sun. It will always say that. I'll keep the fire lit for him, just in case he ever needs to find his way home. And after that, the pages were blank. Marlowe closed the journal and sat in the dark and the cold with it pressed against her chest. And she found that she was crying quietly, without quite having noticed when she'd started. Because this was not the story she had been told. This was not a man who had thrown his family away.
This was not a cold, uncaring stranger who wanted nothing to do with them. This was a father who had been left behind, a man who had stood in the door of his shop and watched his only son drive off toward the bright, wide world, and who had stayed alone in a town that was dying around him, and who had kept a single fire burning for years on the chance, the wild, hopeless, faithful chance that one day his boy might come home. And his boy never did. And then Silas had died, and he had left it all, the shop, the tools, the fire, the whole sad, faithful story to her. The daughter of the sun, the last of the line, a granddaughter he had never met. She didn't know how long she sat there. The light outside the dirty window had gone from gray to a deep, cold blue, and the dark in the shop had thickened until her little flashlight seemed to barely push it back at all. And it was as she finally moved to stand to make her way back up to the apartment before the last light failed entirely that her flashlight beam fell across something on the dirt floor near the foot of the workbench. She froze. A footprint, not hers. She looked back at the trail she'd left coming in from the stairs, the soft dust she'd disturbed the clear scuffs of her own shoes. But this was over here, by the bench where she had not yet walked. And it was sharp, clean. The waffle tread of a work boot pressed firm into the floor. And it was recent. She crouched and brought the light close, and her heart began to beat hard and slow against her ribs. The dust in this whole place lay thick, and even a smooth gray blanket undisturbed for years. Everything wore it. The tools, the benches, the anvil. Everything had been sleeping under that same soft coat of time. But this footprint had no dust in it. Someone had been down here recently, after Silas died. After the place was supposed to have been locked and empty and forgotten. Someone had stood right there at the foot of the main workbench, close to the anvil, and had not left so much as a note or a moved tool to say why. Marlowe stood up slowly, her light swinging now from shape to shape. The patient, hulking shadows of the shop, suddenly not so patient. She thought of Miss Hale's hand on her arm and her voice careful and low. A place that's been shut up and empty a long time, it holds more than dust. She went back up the stairs faster than she'd come down them. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She lay on top of the faded quilt in her grandfather's bed, in her coat, with the photograph of her parents on the wall above her, and the iron key in her fist. And she listened to the house settle and tick around her every creak of old wood, loud as a footstep in the dark. It was some time past midnight when she saw the light. She was lying with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, when a pale beam slid across it, thin, white, sharp. It moved across the plaster and down the wall and was gone. And then it came again, sweeping the other way. A flashlight. outside. Below. Marlo rolled off the bed and went to the window on her hands and knees, keeping low, and she lifted herself just high enough to look down through the grime into the dirt yard at the base of the building. There was a man down there. She could see only his shape, a dark figure against the darker night, and the cone of his flashlight as it played over the foundation of the shop along the base of the brick into the weeds. He moved slow, careful. He walked the length of the building, the light hunting low along the wall, and at the corner he stopped and stood for a long moment looking up, and Marlo dropped flat her cheek against the cold, dusty floor, her heart slamming. When she dared to look again, he was walking away, the flashlight swinging at his side, his shape dissolving into the black mouth of the woods behind the town. She watched until she couldn't see him anymore. She watched a long time after that. She did not sleep. The phone rang at 8 the next morning. It was the cheap landline on the kitchen wall, an old beige thing she hadn't even known was connected. And when it rang in that dead, silent apartment, it was so loud and so sudden that she nearly dropped the cup of bad instant coffee she'd made from a tin she'd found in the cupboard. She picked it up. "Hello, Miss Ash." The voice was smooth, warm, professionally kind in the way a thing can be kind that has no actual warmth behind it. "Marcus Vane. I represent the buyers on your grandfather's property. I do hope I'm not catching you too early. I understand you've made the trip up to Stonebridge. That was, let's say, more than I expected. Most young people in your situation would have simply mailed back the paperwork." Marlo said nothing. She gripped the phone and looked at the window where the morning light came in gray. "I'll be direct because I respect your time," Vane went on. "My clients are very eager to close on that block, and your property is the last piece. The offer on the table is extremely generous. Frankly, it's more than the building is worth, considerably more." A small pause, and then the warmth in his voice cooled just slightly. Just enough. I should mention in the interest of full disclosure that the property carries a significant tax burden. Several years of unpaid taxes, in fact, and the building itself has accumulated a number of code violations. Structurally, it's been condemned in all but name. A teardown, really. The county could move on it at any time, and if they do, you'd be left holding the debt and nothing else. He let that sit. "What my clients are offering you, Miss Ash, is a clean exit. A great deal of money and an end to a problem that, forgive me, a young woman in your circumstances is in no position to take on alone." Marlo looked out the window down at the dirt yard where a few hours ago, in the dark, a stranger had walked the length of the building with a flashlight hunting low along the wall, looking for something. "You sound like you really want it," she said quietly. There was the briefest silence on the line. "I beg your pardon." "The building," Marlo said. "For a teardown in a dead town, you sound like you want it an awful lot." The pause this time was longer. And when Vane spoke again, the warmth was gone entirely, and what was left underneath it was smooth and flat and cold as the face of the anvil down in the dark. My clients are not accustomed to waiting, Miss Ash, he said, and they are not accustomed to no. I'd urge you to think very carefully. You're alone, you're 18 years old, and you have no idea what that building is, or what it's worth, or who else has been interested in it over the years. The hair stood up on the back of Marlowe's neck. You have until the end of the month, Vane said. I would strongly advise you not to make a sentimental mistake. And the line went dead.
Marlowe set the phone slowly back in its cradle. She stood there a long moment in the cold gray light of her dead grandfather's kitchen, the coffee going cold in her hand, and she looked down at the dirt yard and then up at the faded sign she knew was hanging out there on the front of the building, the one with her father's name on it. Ash and Son. A man had walked the foundation in the dark. A lawyer with a warm voice and cold words wanted this dead building badly enough to threaten an orphan over the phone. A grandfather she'd been told had abandoned her, had kept a fire burning for 30 years, and left a single line crossed out in his journal. She hadn't told anyone about a line she'd found late the night before near the end, smudged, half-scratched away, that she couldn't get out of her head. The accident wasn't, that was all there was. The rest was scribbled out, raked over so hard the pen had torn the page. The accident wasn't, and then nothing. The accident. The car crash, the thing that had taken her mother and father from her when she was 7 years old and dropped her into the system for a decade. The accident wasn't Marlowe. Stood in the cold light and felt something move in her chest. And it was not grief this time, and it was not fear. It was the first faint, dangerous heat of wanting to know. She wasn't going to sell. She knew that now the way she knew her own name. Whatever was buried in this place, whatever her grandfather had kept lit the fire for whatever a stranger had come hunting for in the dark, she was going to find it first. She set down the cold coffee. And she went to find the way back down to the forge. Marlowe spent the next 3 days learning what it meant to be alone in a place that did not want her. She started with the shop because the shop was the heart of it, and because the journal and the crossed-out line and the footprint in the dust had all pointed her down those narrow stairs into the dark. By daylight, the forge was less like a cathedral and more like a job. An enormous, filthy, decades-deep job. She found a stack of clean rags and a tin of oil on a shelf. And she found a push broom with half its bristles worn away. And she started at the front by the dirty window and worked her way back 1 square foot at a time. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done in her life. She swept 10 years of dust into gray drifts and carried them out the side door in a bucket. She wiped the rust film off the tools one by one and oiled the hammer handles where the wood had gone dry and pale, and as she worked, her hands began to ache in a way she had never felt a deep ache in the small muscles that nobody back at Briarwood had ever needed to use. She scrubbed the soot off the front of the forge. She wiped down the great scarred face of the anvil until the dark steel showed through.
And the strange thing, the thing she could not have explained to Ms. Hale or anyone, was that it didn't feel like cleaning. It felt like a handshake. Every tool she lifted had been shaped to a hand that wasn't hers. The hammers were worn smooth in the exact places a grip would wear them. The face of the anvil had faint, ghostly marks across it, where for 40 years a man had set hot steel down to test the heat. She was not cleaning a building. She was touching the worn places her grandfather had left behind, the way you'd run your fingers over a name carved in stone. She read the journal at night. She read the books from his nightstand, 2 old technical manuals with cracked spines and titles like The Properties of Ferrous Metals, full of diagrams and tables she barely understood. She fell asleep over them with her grandfather's reading glasses pushed up on her own forehead, having tried them on to see, and the prescription was almost exactly hers. The town watched her do all of it, and the town did not approve. She felt it the first time she walked into the corner store, the one open business on the dead street run by a sharp-eyed woman of maybe 70, named Verna Tate, who stood behind the counter like she'd grown there. Marlowe had come in for bread and milk and a box of nails, and Verna had rung her up in silence and watched her over the tops of her glasses the whole time, the way you watch a stray dog you haven't decided about yet. "You're the granddaughter," Verna said. It wasn't a question. "Marlowe." "I know what your name is." Verna pushed the bag across the counter. "Everybody on this street knows what your name is." She looked Marlowe up and down, the dust in her hair, the blisters starting on her palms, the set of her jaw. "Word is, you mean to work the forge." "I mean to try." Verna made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Honey, there hasn't been a smith in that shop in years, and the last one died waiting for a man who never came. And you think you're going to light that fire? A girl who weighs $110 soaking wet." She shook her head and turned back to her shelves. "Take the money those developer people are waving around. Take it and go live a life. This town's a grave. Don't go climbing into it." Marlowe took her bag and went to the door. And then she stopped with her hand on the cold glass, and she turned back. "He kept the fire lit 30 years for my father," she said. "Nobody came. So now I'm here." She pushed the door open. "I'd rather be the one who came too late than one more person who never showed up." She didn't wait to see Verna's face, but she heard behind her as the door swung shut a long silence. And the silence was not the same as the one she'd walked in on. Old Otis Marsh came 2 days later. He was a farmer somewhere north of 70, with hands like cracked leather and a battered truck that idled rough out front. He didn't knock. He just slid the big front door open enough to put his head in. Marlowe had finally gotten the rusted padlock off with penetrating oil and a hacksaw, and he stood there a moment looking at the cleaned-up shop
with an expression she couldn't read. "Heard somebody woke this place up," he said. "That's me." He came in slow, turning in a circle, taking in the swept floor and the oiled tools, and something in his weathered face softened by a degree. "Your granddad forged the hinges on my barn door," Otis said. 40 years back, big double doors heavy as sin. Those hinges still swing true, never sagged a quarter inch in 40 years. He looked at her. "Man like that, you don't forget." He stayed the whole afternoon. He didn't ask for anything, and he didn't take anything. He showed her how the great power hammer in the corner worked, how the leather belts ran off the old motor, how to oil the bearings so they wouldn't seize. He showed her how the coal blower fed air up under the forge to drive the fire hot. He told her things about her grandfather in small pieces, that Silas had been stubborn as a fence post, that he'd fix a man's plow for a handshake when times were hard, that toward the end he kept more and more to himself.
"We all figured he was just waiting on something," Otis said near the end, settling his hat back on his head to go. "Town like this, a man gets quiet." He looked at her a long moment in the doorway. "Guess he was waiting on you." And then he was gone, the truck coughing away down the dirt road, and Marlowe stood alone in the swept and oiled shop, and felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that bus, like maybe she wasn't entirely an island. She was wrong about that, though it took her a while to learn it. The only person in Stonebridge anywhere near her own age was a young mechanic named Dale Cutter. She met him because his garage, a low cinder block building, 2 streets over, the only other place in town besides Verna's that showed any sign of life, was the only place that sold the kind of heavy work gloves she needed, and the welding supplies and the long bar stock she'd started buying once she got brave enough to think about actually lighting the forge. Dale was maybe 20, lean and quick with grease worked permanently into the creases of his knuckles, and a quick, crooked grin that came easy. He thought what she was doing was the most interesting thing that had happened in Stonebridge in years. "Nobody our age stays here," he told her, leaning on the counter while he rang up her bar stock. "Nobody. You graduate, you leave, that's the whole plan. There's nothing here." He shook his head, grinning. "And then you show up out of nowhere to light up a forge that's been cold since before we were born. It's the best thing I've ever seen."
He started coming by. He'd bring tools, scrap metal, an old welding rig his uncle had left in the garage. He helped her wrestle the rebuilt motor onto the power hammer. He was easy to be around in a way almost no one had ever been easy for Marlowe. He didn't look at her like a case file or a problem or a charity. He looked at her like a person doing something interesting, and he wanted to help. She told him things, slowly, more than she'd told anyone in years, about Briarwood, about aging out, about the photograph on the wall and the journal in the toolbox and the line that was scratched out. She did not tell him about the footprint or the man with the flashlight in the dark. She wished later that she had paid more attention to the way his grin slipped sometimes when she wasn't looking. It was Dale, actually, who helped her light the fire for the first time. She'd been afraid of it, The forge was the one thing she'd left for last, and she knew why, because lighting it made it real. A girl sweeping dust was just cleaning a building. A girl who lit the fire was something else. She was claiming it. Otis had shown her the principle, and the journal had shown her the rest. And one cold afternoon with Dale, watching from a workbench, she finally did it. She built a small bed of kindling in the great soot-blackened heart of the forge and laid coal around it, the way her grandfather's notes described. And she lit it, and she worked the blower with one hand, slow and steady, feeding it air. The fire caught. It crept, and then it spread, and then it roared, a deep, living, orange roar that filled the whole cavernous shop with light and heat and chased the shadows back into the high corners where they belonged. Marlowe stood in front of it, with her face lit gold and the heat pressing against her like a hand, and she felt something in her chest crack open that had been closed her whole life. The fire was lit. After 30 years, the fire was lit.
Okay, Dale said quietly behind her. Okay, that's something.
She didn't answer. She couldn't. She was watching the flames, and she was thinking about a lonely old man feeding a fire, just like this, 1 year after year, for a son who would never walk back through the door. She heated her first piece of steel that night, just a length of bar stock, no purpose to it, just to feel it. She watched the dark metal go from black to a deep cherry red to a bright glowing orange, and she lifted it with the tongs and set it on the anvil and struck it with a hammer, and the ring of it went up clear and bright into the high dark of the ceiling, the first hammer blow that shop had heard in years. It rang like a bell. It rang like something coming back to life.
The line in the journal would not leave her alone. The accident wasn't.
She went back to it again and again in the lamplight, holding the page at angles, trying to read the words beneath the angry scratching that had nearly torn through the paper. She could make out almost nothing. A loop here, the ghost of a letter there. But she became certain of one thing. It wasn't crossed out the way you cross out a mistake. It was scratched out the way you bury something. Hard. Over and over. The pen had gone through in 2 places. A man does that to a sentence he is afraid of. And she kept coming back to the footprint at the foot of the workbench. By the anvil. The anvil. It was Otis, without knowing it, who pointed her at the answer. He'd come by again with a sack of sandwiches from Verna. The 2 of them had apparently decided between themselves that the girl needed feeding, and he stood admiring the anvil, running a hand over its scarred face.
Old Peter Wright, this,
he said.
Best they ever made. Your granddad kept it like a king. Wouldn't let a speck of rust touch it.
He thumped the great oak stump it was mounted on.
And this base. He cut this stump himself. Sank it 4 feet into the ground so it wouldn't move when he worked. Heavy as a tombstone.
He left, and Marlowe stayed by the anvil after he'd gone. She had cleaned every inch of this shop, but she had cleaned the anvil's face. She had never been underneath it. She'd never had a reason to. She got down on her hands and knees in the dirt with her flashlight, and she went over the great oak stump from the top down, and at the very bottom, near the floor, on the side facing the wall, where no one would ever see it. She found two things. The first was a small brass plaque, green-black with age, screwed into the wood. She wiped it clean with her thumb, and there were words engraved on it. A line, a creed. What the hammer creates, the hand must not betray. She knelt there in the dirt and read it 3 times. A smith's proverb. Her grandfather had put it where no customer would ever see it, where only the man at the anvil, only the next man at the anvil would find it. It wasn't decoration. It was a message. This is a trust. Don't betray it. And then her flashlight found the second thing, and her heart began to pound. Set into the side of the oak base, so flush and so cleverly hidden that her fingers found it before her eyes did, was a keyhole. A lock, tiny, intricate, built into the wood of the anvil stand on the hidden side down where you'd have to be on your knees with a light to ever know it was there. Marlowe sat back on her heels in the dirt, her breath coming fast. The footprint, right here, by the anvil. Whoever had been in the shop in the dark had stood right here at the one place in the entire building that held a hidden lock. They knew. Whoever they were, they knew there was something in the anvil. And they had been looking for the key. So had Marlowe now for the next 2 days, and she tore the place apart looking for it. The iron skeleton key was for the apartment door. The little flat key was for the handmade toolbox. Neither would fit this tiny ornate keyhole, not even close. She searched every drawer in the shop, every coffee can full of old bolts, every shelf and rafter and hiding place she could imagine. She went up to the apartment and searched it again, room by room, under the mattress, behind the books, in the pockets of an old coat that still hung in the closet and still faintly smelled of coal smoke. Nothing. And the longer she searched and didn't find it, the more the cold, practical voice came back. Maybe it's meant to stay locked. Maybe this is the sign. Take the money. Sign the paper. Walk away from the ghost and his riddles before whoever's walking around in the dark comes back when you're standing in the yard instead of safe upstairs. She slumped into the dusty armchair in the apartment defeated late on the second night, and her eye fell on the framed photograph of her parents on the wall. She got up and lifted it down. She'd looked at it 100 times, but now she turned it over in her hands and she looked at the back, the dusty cardboard backing held in by little bent tabs, and she thought people hide things behind photographs. She bent the tabs back and slid the backing out, hoping for a key taped to the cardboard. There was no key, but the backing was wrong. It was too thick. It was 2 pieces of cardboard, not one pressed and glued together at the edges. Her heart climbing into her throat, she worked her thumbnail into the seam and pried gently, and the 2 pieces came apart. And there, taped into a hollow scooped out between them, flat and small, and waiting was a key. It was brass and ornate, and its handle was shaped like a tiny hammer. Marlowe did not remember the trip down the stairs. One moment she was in the armchair with the photograph in pieces in her lap, and the next she was on her knees in the dirt by the anvil with the little hammer-shaped key in fingers that shook so hard it took her 3 tries to fit it into the lock. It slid home. She turned it. There was a soft, deep click, a sound of a mechanism waking after years, and a panel in the side of the great oak stump sprang loose under her fingers. Behind it was a hollow chamber cut into the heart of the wood. And inside the chamber were 2 things. The first was a metal cash box, heavy, the kind with a handle on top. The second, lying on top of the box, was a sealed envelope, crisp, new, not yellowed like the journal written recently. And on the front, in the spidery hand she now knew as well as her own, Marlowe. She sat down hard in the dirt with her back against the cold base of the anvil, and she opened it, and she read her grandfather's last words to her by the light of the forge fire. My dear Marlowe, if you are reading this, you have found your way home, and you are smarter and more stubborn than I had any right to hope. Good. You'll need to be both. The first thing I owe you is the word I'm sorry. I am sorry I was never in your life. I am sorry for the silence. I have rehearsed 1,000 ways to say it, and there is no good way, so I will just say it plain and trust you to understand it by the time you finish this letter. You have found the journal, so you know the easy part of the story. You know I taught your father this trade, and you know I lost him to the city. What you do not know, what no one in this town knows, what I have carried alone for 11 years, is the rest of it. Marlowe, your parents' accident was not an accident. Marlowe stopped reading. She had to. The words swam. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her eyes and made herself breathe, and the forge ticked and settled beside her. And then she read on. There were men who wanted this town. Years ago, when the mill closed and the people started leaving, men moved in quiet to buy up the whole downtown for nothing, parcel by parcel, leaning on folks who'd given up hope. It was never about a town. It was about what a dying, half-empty place with no eyes on it is worth to men who need to move money through somewhere. No one is watching. I would not sell. I was the last one who would not sell. This block does not work for them without my shop, and I would not sell it at any price, because a man who sells the thing his own hands and his own father's hands built has nothing left worth keeping. That made me a problem. They came to me first with money, then with threats. I am a stubborn old man, and I have buried better men than the ones they sent, and I told them where they could go. I thought the danger was mine alone. I was wrong. That is the great sin of my life, and I will carry it past the grave. 11 years ago, they sent me a message. They did not touch me. They touched what I loved. Your mother and father did not die on that road by chance, Marlowe. Their car was made to fail. It was made to look like a tragedy, and everyone believed it was a tragedy, and your father and your mother were buried as the victims of bad luck and bad weather. But it was not luck. It was a message to me, and I understood it.
The day after I buried my son, I got a phone call. A voice I will not forget. It told me that if I ever went to the police, or if I ever tried to take in my granddaughter, if I ever so much as put my name beside yours on a single piece of paper, the same thing that happened to your parents would happen to you. So I made the hardest choice a man has ever made. I let you go.
I had a granddaughter, the last of my blood, 7 years old and alone in the world. And I let the state take you away to strangers, and I let you grow up believing I was a man who didn't want you. I did it because the only way I knew to keep you alive was to make sure those men believed you meant nothing to me.
As long as you were nothing to me, you were no use to them. So I made myself nothing. I erased myself from your file. I became the ghost they needed me to be.
Understand me, child. Not a day passed that I did not think of you. Marlowe's vision had gone fully to water now, and she let it. The letter trembled in her hands. Every year on your birthday, I drove the 3 hours to the city. I never came to the door. I never spoke to you. I would park across the street from that home, and I would wait sometimes for hours just to see you come out into the yard, just to see you were alive, to see you were getting taller. Once I saw you laughing at something with another girl, and I sat in my truck and wept like a child, because you had your mother's laugh, and I had not known that, and I could not tell you.
I have been your grandfather every single day of your life. You just could not see me. This trade teaches a man patience, Marlowe. It teaches you that the hardest things can only be made with fire and with time, that you cannot rush steel any more than you can rush grief. I could not protect your father. I will answer for that. But I could protect you, and I could prepare for you, and for 11 years, that is what I did. I took every job that came. I lived on almost nothing, and everything I earned, I put away for you. It is in this box. It is not a fortune, but it is clean, and it is honest, and it is yours, and it is the only weapon I am able to put into your hands from where I am going.
She lifted the lid of the cash box. It was full of money, stacks of it banded and neat packed in tight. She didn't count it. It didn't matter how much it was. What struck her, what put a fist around her heart, was the weight of it, the sheer physical fact of it. 11 years. 11 years of a lonely old man, taking every small job and living on nothing and putting it away one bill at a time for a granddaughter
he was forbidden to touch. It was not money. It was 11 years of love that had nowhere else to go, pressed flat and saved in the dark.
There was more to the letter. One last part. There will be men who come for this land, Marlowe. They may already have. They will smell money the moment my death is recorded, because my death is the thing they have been waiting 11 years for. They will send a smooth man with paper and a number on it, and the number will be large, and it will be the easiest thing in the world to take it. Do not take it, not because of sentiment. Sentiment is cheap. Take it or don't take it for one reason only. Those men are the same men who killed your mother and father. The smooth man with the paper works for them. I do not know all their names, but I have spent 11 years quietly learning some of what they did, and I have not been idle, and I have left you more than money. I have left you the truth. I could not write it in a book that a man might find. So I forged it where no man would look and no fire would reach it. You are a smith now, or you are becoming one, and a smith knows that some things are made to last and made to be found by the right hand. Trust the creed on the plaque. Trust the work. When the time comes that you need it, you will know where to look because you will think like I think. Our name means something, child. Ash. We are what's left when the fire's done its work, and we are also what makes the next fire catch. We do not burn away to nothing. We endure. We do not break easy. The choice is yours. It was always going to be yours. But know that this shop is more than brick and wood. It is a place where a person can take the hardest, coldest, most unforgiving thing there is, and with fire and will and her own two hands, make it into something true. That is the real inheritance. The money is only money. The rest is who you are. Your loving grandfather, Silas Marlowe, sat against the base of the anvil for a long time and cried for all of them. She cried for the grandfather she had never met, who had watched her from a parked truck for 11 years and wept at her mother's laugh. She cried for her father and mother, who had not died on a wet road by accident, but had been killed as a message to a stubborn old man who wouldn't sell a building. She cried for the 7-year-old girl who had stood at the window of the Briarwood home, wishing for a family that she'd been told had thrown her away, and who had been wrong, so completely wrong, all this time. She hadn't been thrown away. She had been protected. She had been loved fiercely secretly from a distance by a man who gave up the only family he had left to keep her breathing. When she could finally see again, she folded the letter and put it inside her coat against her chest. And she sat with the forge fire ticking down beside her, and slowly, the grief in her began to change into something else, something cold and clear and steady. She wanted their names.
She started the next morning, and she was careful because her grandfather had been careful, and she understood now what carelessness had cost him. She took the bus to the larger town 20 miles north, the one with a real bank and a real county records office. And she did two things. First, she put most of the money from the box into an account in her own name, keeping out enough cash to live on and to fight with. Second, she pulled every public record she could find on the property at 114 Forge Road, and on the company that wanted it, and on the man whose name was on the offer letter. Marcus Vane was a lawyer who represented a single major client. That client was a development corporation, and it took her most of a day in the records office following the corporation up through a chain of holding companies like climbing a ladder in the dark. But at the very top of all of it, the name that owned the companies, that wanted her grandfather's shop was a man, Roland Pierce. She wrote the name down. She looked at it on the page, and then she went looking for who he was, and what she found turned her cold. Pierce was wealthy and respectable, and the public face of the whole Stonebridge revitalization. There were photographs of him at ribbon cuttings articles, calling him a man bringing hope back to forgotten towns. He bought up dying main streets across the region, the stories said, and breathed new life into them. A philanthropist, a builder. But the records told the quieter story underneath that one, if you read them the way Marlowe had learned to read a thing, slow and patient, and from the bottom up, the way you read a journal that's been scratched over. The revitalizations that never got built. The properties bought for nothing and sold for fortunes between companies that all turned out to be the same company. Money flowing into the dead towns and money flowing out, and very little ever actually built. Her grandfather's words came back to her. A place no one is watching. That was what Pierce bought. Not towns, blind spots. And one more thing. Buried in an old archived news item from 11 years back, a short piece about Pierce expanding into the Stonebridge area and a date. A date she knew. A date carved into a headstone in the little cemetery at the edge of town where she had walked one evening and found her mother and father lying side by side under granite gone gray with age, and an empty space beside them where she now understood a stubborn old man had always meant to lie. The date Pierce came to Stonebridge. The date her parents died. They were the same month, the same year. Marlowe sat in the county records office with the photocopies spread in front of her, and she understood finally and completely that the man who wanted her grandfather's shop today, the smooth, respectable philanthropist in the ribbon-cutting photos, was the same man who had ordered her mother and father killed 11 years ago. The same hand. The whole way down, she rode the bus back to Stonebridge in the dark, and she watched the power lines dip and rise outside the window, and she made a plan. She would find the truth her grandfather had forged and hidden. She would find his proof. I have left you more than money. I have left you the truth, and when she had it, she would not be a girl alone against a powerful man. She would be a girl with evidence. And then she would burn Roland Pierce's whole world down the way he had burned hers. She just had to find it first, before they did. She told Dale almost none of it. That was instinct, and she would be grateful for that instinct later, though not for the reason she expected. But she told him some. She had to. She needed help, and he was the only person near her age she had, and over the weeks, he'd become the one person she'd let close. She told him she'd found out the developers weren't what they seemed. She told him there might be something hidden in the shop that they wanted. She told him she wasn't going to sell no matter what, and that she thought she might be in over her head. She watched his face when she said it, and she saw something move across it that she didn't have a name for at the time. She thought it was worry. Worry for her. It was worry, all right. It just wasn't for her. You should be careful, Dale said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Guys like that, they don't mess around. I know, Marlowe said. That's kind of the point. It was that night that the shop burned, or nearly did. She woke past 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke and the orange flicker of light coming up the internal stairs from the forge below. She was down those stairs before she was fully awake, her heart hammering, and she burst into the shop to find flames climbing the wall by the main workbench, fed by an overturned can of oil. The dry old wood of the bench already catching the fire, crawling fast and hungry toward the shelves and the rafters and the ceiling 2 stories up. She didn't think. She grabbed the slack tub, the great iron trough of water by the forge, where a smith quenches hot steel, and she heaved it water and all. And it took the worst of the bench fire down in a roar of steam. She beat at the rest with a wet canvas tarp, screaming, her arms burning the smoke, tearing at her lungs until the last of the flames guttered and died. And she stood there in the dark, and the steam soaked, shaking alive. When the smoke cleared enough to see, she found that the fire had not started by accident. The oil can had been carried in and overturned deliberately at the base of the workbench. And the workbench was the bench beneath the front window, the bench nearest the anvil. The bench where the footprint had been. They hadn't come to scare her this time. They'd come to burn the place down, to burn whatever was hidden in it, to turn the whole problem to ash before she could find what her grandfather had buried. And the back door, the side door she always kept barred, stood open, unbarred, from the inside. Marlowe stood in the wet ruins with her flashlight and looked at that open door, and a cold understanding settled into her stomach like a stone. Someone had let them in. There were only a handful of people who'd been inside this shop. Otis, Verna, and one young man with grease in the creases of his knuckles and an easy crooked grin, who knew her routine, who knew she slept upstairs, who knew exactly where the slack tub stood and where the side door's bar hung. A young man she had let closer than she'd let anyone in years, and who had gone very quiet
and would not meet her eyes the last time she told him she thought she was in over her head. She drove out to Dale's garage at 3 in the morning, soaked and reeking of smoke, and she pounded on the door of the little apartment behind it until he opened it, and the look on his face when he saw her standing there told her everything before either of them said a word. He didn't even try to lie. That was almost the worst part. He just looked at her, and his face came apart, and he said, Marlo, I'm sorry. I didn't think they said they just wanted to scare you. They said nobody'd get... You let them in. My dad, he said, and his voice broke. He's got debts, Marlo, the kind of debts you don't walk away from, and they own the paper on it. They own him, and they said, if I just told them when and left the door, they said nobody would get hurt. He was crying now, this grown man in the doorway. I never thought they'd burn it with you sleeping right up the... Get away from me, Marlo said. Marlo, get away from me. She drove back to the shop in the dark alone, the way she had been alone her whole life, and she sat down on the cold steps of the building. Her grandfather had died protecting, soaked, and smelling of smoke, with the proof she couldn't find somewhere in the walls behind her, and the men who'd killed her family closing in from every direction, and the one person she'd trusted in this whole dead town revealed as the hand that had opened the door. She was 18 years old. She had a building they wanted to burn, a fortune. They wanted to take a truth she couldn't find, and not one single soul left she could trust. And somewhere out past the dark line of the woods, she knew Roland Pierce was being told that the fire had failed, which meant they would come again. And next time she understood, sitting there in the cold with her grandfather's letter against her chest, next time they would not bother with a warning at all. Marlo did not sleep that night, and she did not cry, and somewhere in the long, cold hours before dawn, she stopped being afraid. It was not courage exactly. It was something quieter and harder than that. She sat on the steps until the sky went from black to the bruised gray of early morning, and somewhere in there, the fear simply burned itself out, the way a fire burns down to coals, and what was left underneath was steady and hot and would not go out. She had spent her whole life being told who she was by other people. A file, a number, a ward, a problem to be passed along. And now there were men who wanted to tell her one more thing, that she was a girl too small and too alone to matter a loose end to be tidied up. They were wrong. She was Silas Ash's granddaughter, and she was done letting other people decide what she was. She went back inside as the sun came up, and she stood in the wet, smoke-stained ruin of the workbench, and she made herself think the way her grandfather had told her to think. I forged it where no man would look and no fire would reach it. She had read that line 12 times and read it wrong every time. She'd taken it to mean the proof was somewhere fire couldn't get to a hidden chamber A buried box the way the letter and the money had been hidden in the anvil's base. But she'd searched the base. There was nothing else in it. She'd torn the apartment apart, the shop apart. There was no other hiding place. No fire would reach it. She stood in front of the great cold forge, and she looked at the proverb in her mind. The creed on the brass plaque, down in the dark beneath the anvil. What the hammer creates, the hand must not betray. What the hammer creates. And all at once she understood, and the understanding ran down her spine like cold water. He hadn't hidden it near the fire. He hadn't hidden it where fire couldn't reach. He'd hidden it inside the work itself, inside something he had made with the hammer and the fire, something that fire couldn't destroy because it had already been born in fire, forged and shaped and sealed, something that would sit in plain sight in a shop full of iron, looking like nothing at all, because it would look like exactly what everything else in that shop looked like. A piece of steel. She turned slowly and looked at the shop with new eyes. At the hammers on the walls, the half-finished pieces, the scrap, the bar stock, the 100 lengths and bars and lumps of dark iron that filled every shelf and bench and corner of the place. The proof was one of them. He had forged it into a piece of metal and set it down among 1,000 other pieces of metal, and a man could burn this whole building to the ground and shovel through the ashes for a week and never find it, because steel does not burn. But which one? You will know where to look, because you will think like I think. She started where it mattered most. By the anvil, by the place the footprint had been, the place the intruder had stood, the place Silas had built his hidden lock, because a man hides the second secret close to the first. She went over the shelves and benches in a radius around the anvil, lifting every loose piece of steel, hefting each one, looking at it, setting it down. And on a low shelf below the main bench, in among a row of ordinary bar stock, she found a bar that did not belong. It looked like the others. Same length near enough. Same dark scaled surface. But when she lifted it, it was wrong. It was too heavy, far heavier than a solid bar of that size had any right to be. And when she turned it in the light, she saw faint, almost invisible under the black scale, a mark struck into one end. A maker's mark, the kind a smith stamps into his finished work. An ash leaf. Crude, simple, struck with a hand punch. The mark of ash. Marlowe carried it to the anvil and set it down and stood over it, her heart going hard because she understood what she had to do now, and it felt like a sacrilege. He had forged this. He had sealed something inside it with fire and a hammer. His last work, the truth of his whole life, made into a bar of steel. And to get it out, she would have to put it back in the fire and break it open. So she lit the forge. She built the fire the way she'd learned kindling in coal, and she worked the blower steady and slow, and the fire crept and spread and roared up orange and alive, and she laid the heavy bar in the heart of it, and she waited. She watched the dark steel go from black to dull red to cherry to a glowing, furious orange, the way she'd watched her practice bars do it. And when it was hot all through, she lifted it with the tongs and laid it on the anvil, and she took up the heaviest hammer she could swing.
And she went to work.
It was clumsy at first. She was no master, and she knew it. But somewhere between the third blow and the 10th, something happened that she could not have explained. Her grandfather's hand seemed to come into hers. The rhythm she'd read about in the journal and felt in the worn handles, the steady ring of steel on steel, and she found it. She found the work, and the bar began to open along a seam. She could see now a join he'd welded shut in the fire 11 years ago, and that only fire could open again. It split. It split along its length and folded back, and there inside the bar of steel, sealed in a hollow he had forged into its heart, wrapped in a fold of metal that had kept it through fire and time, was a small flat packet. She quenched the steel and pried the hollow open with the chisel and lifted the packet out with her bare fingers, and it was warm, but it was whole. Inside was a small notebook, the pages dense with her grandfather's spidery hand. And folded into the notebook was a single, small, flat key brass with a number stamped on it. A safe deposit box key. She sat down on the dirt floor by the warm anvil and opened the notebook and read, and it was all there. 11 years of a patient, stubborn old man who everyone thought was just a recluse waiting to die, and who had instead been quietly, carefully, methodically building a case. Dates, names, the companies, and the men who ran them, the same chain Marlowe had climbed, in the records office traced all the way to the top to Roland Pierce. And more than she could have found in any public record, a name, a confession, overheard a meeting, witnessed the threads connecting the murder of his son and daughter-in-law to the man who had ordered it. He had not been able to prove it to the law 11 years ago, with a threat hanging over a 7-year-old girl. So he had spent the rest of his life gathering it piece by piece and locking it away where it would wait until the girl was grown, and the threat was his alone to answer for in death, with the truth in her hands. The safe deposit key, the last page said, opened a box in the bank 20 miles north. The same bank where Marlowe had opened her own account, and in that box was the rest. The documents, the originals, everything. Marlowe sat on the floor of the forge with the notebook in her lap and the warm, split bar of steel beside her, and she understood finally the whole shape of it. The real inheritance, not the money. The money was a tool, like the letter said. The real inheritance was this, the truth forged into steel, kept through fire, waiting for the right hand. Her grandfather had given her the one weapon that could finish what he never could. She wasn't done finding things, though, because as she set the broken bar back on the shelf where she'd found it, her eye caught another piece beside it that she'd passed over a hammer, not a bar,
hanging on a peg below the bench. Smaller than the working hammers, beautifully made the handle smooth and pale and unworn. A new hammer, never used. And along the side of the head, struck deep and clean, were letters. She lifted it down and turned it to the light, and her breath caught. It wasn't a maker's mark this time. It was a name. Marlowe, her name, forged into the steel of a hammer struck deep, made to last 100 years. A hammer made for a hand that had never come, made years ago. She could see by the look of the steel made and hung on the peg and waited over. And she understood the last thing, then the thing the sign over the door had never quite said. Ash and Son. That was the old name, her father's name, the dream that had broken when Daniel drove away. But her grandfather, in the dark of his last years alone, forbidden to so much as write her name on a piece of paper, her grandfather had taken up a hammer and forged her name into steel anyway. Not Son, not the dream he'd lost. Her, Marlowe. He had made her a hammer and hung it on the wall and kept the fire lit all those years, not for a son who would never come home. For her, he had always meant the shop to be hers. Marlowe stood in the middle of the forge holding the hammer with her name on it, and she did not cry, though she wanted to. The grief had finished its work and become something else, the way iron in the fire becomes something else. She gripped the hammer, and it fit her hand like it had been made for it, because it had. All right, she said quietly to the empty shop, to the man who wasn't there and had always been there. All right, I'll finish it. And then there was a knock at the side door. She froze. The hammer came up in her hand without her deciding it. But when the door eased open, it was not Pierce's men. It was Dale Cutter, standing in the gray morning light, with his hands open at his sides, and his face gray and hollow, like a man who hadn't slept either. Don't, he said, when he saw the hammer. I'm not here for them. I'm done with them. He took a breath that shook. I came to tell you the truth, all of it. And then you can do whatever you want to me. I won't fight it. Marlowe didn't lower the hammer. You let them burn my shop with me in it. I know. You could have killed me. I know that too. His voice cracked. I've known it every minute since. I didn't sleep. I sat in that garage and I thought about you upstairs over that fire, and He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, the same gesture she'd made over the letter, and for a moment neither of them said anything. My dad's dead, he said finally. It's real. It's bad. They own it, and they used it to own me. And I told myself I was just leaving a door unlocked. I told myself it'd be a little fire, a scare, nothing, but that's a lie. I told myself so I could do it.
There's no version where it's not what it is.
Then why are you here? Marlowe said. Because I copied it. She went still. 2 nights ago, Dale said, before the fire. They had me passing them information about you, about the shop, about what you were finding. And the last thing they sent me was an email chain. Pierce's people talking to each other about the fire, about his jaw worked, about how to handle you after if the fire didn't get whatever they were scared of. Names Marlowe. Plans. It's all in writing because rich men think they're untouchable and they put things in writing. He pulled a phone from his pocket and held it out, the screen lit. I copied all of it before I sent it on. I don't know why I did. I think part of me knew I'd need it. I think part of me knew I'd come here. Marlowe looked at the phone. She did not take it yet. You said they own your father's debt, she said slowly. If you cross them, they'll call it in. He'll lose everything, maybe worse. Dale lowered the phone, but he didn't put it away. I know what it costs. I'm telling you anyway, because the other thing it costs is I let a man like that burn a girl alive to save my own neck, and I can't. His voice gave out. Your granddad fixed my granddad's truck for free one winter when we couldn't pay. I grew up hearing about Silas Ash, the one man in this town who wouldn't bend. And I bent the first time anybody leaned on me. I'm so tired of being the kind of man who bends. He held the phone out again. Take it, please. Let me be on the right side of one thing before it's over. And Marlowe lowered the hammer. She took the phone. She scrolled and she read, and it was exactly what he'd said. The casual, confident cruelty of men who had never once been told no. The plan for the fire. The cold discussion of what came after, of how an 18-year-old with no family and no money would be no trouble to make disappear, of how the whole thing would be cleaned up before the month was out, and the block could finally be theirs. She had her grandfather's 11 years of evidence, the notebook, the safe deposit box, and now she had this Pierce's own people in their own words planning her death. She had everything. What she did not have was a way to use it that didn't end with her dead before it ever reached a courtroom. Because the moment Roland Pierce knew the proof existed, the moment a lawyer or a county sheriff in Pierce's pocket got so much as a whiff of it, Marlowe Ash would have an accident on a wet road just like her parents. She needed Pierce to convict himself somewhere he couldn't reach. She stood in the cold forge with the hammer in one hand and Dale's phone in the other, and slowly, a plan began to take shape in her mind. And it was not a small plan, and it was not a safe one. And it was exactly the kind of stubborn, dangerous, all-or-nothing thing her grandfather would have done. It was clumsy at first. She was no master, and she knew it. But somewhere between the 3rd blow and the 10th, something happened that she could not have explained. Her grandfather's hand seemed to come into hers. The rhythm she'd read about in the journal and felt in the worn handles, the steady ring of steel on steel. And she found it. She found the work and the bar began to open along a seam she could see now. "I'm going to give them what they want," Marlowe said. She told him, and when she finished telling him, he stared at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "That'll work, or it'll get you killed."
"It's worked before,"
Marlowe said. "He killed 2 people to get this shop. He sent men to burn it twice. He wants this building more than anything in the world." She looked around at the swept floor and the oiled tools and the great patient anvil and the fire still glowing low in the forge. "So I'm going to make him come and get it himself." Word travels fast in a small town. That was the thing Marlowe had learned, and now it was the thing she used. She let it slip. She let it slip to exactly the right people in exactly the right way, knowing it would carry. She told Verna in the corner store with her voice low and her eyes red that she'd finally found what her grandfather hid, that it was proof of what really happened to her parents, proof of everything, and she didn't know what to do with it. And she was scared, and she was keeping it at the shop until she could figure out who to take it to. She said it like a frightened girl, talking too much to the only person who'd been kind to her. And she knew Verna would never repeat it, but she also knew that a small town has more ears than mouths, and that somewhere in Stonebridge still was at least one more set of eyes that reported to Roland Pierce, and that the news, the proof exists, and it's at the shop, and the girl doesn't know what to do with it, would reach the one man it was meant for fast. Then she set her trap. She and Dale rigged the shop. Not with anything dangerous with the phone. Dale's old phone, the smashed-looking one nobody would think twice about. Set on a high shelf among the junk and the scrap recording with the second feed running live to a laptop in Otis's truck, parked dark in the woods behind the building. And from there, Dale swore the connection would hold straight to the state police investigator, who by then had spent 2 days reading an old Smith's notebook and a folder of originals from a safe deposit box and a copied email chain about a planned murder, and who had become very quickly extremely interested in the affairs of the respectable Mr. Roland Pierce. And then Marlowe waited. She waited in the forge alone, the way she had done everything in her life alone. She kept the fire low and orange. She kept the great front door cracked in invitation. She kept her grandfather's hammer, the one with her name on it, within reach on the anvil. And she kept the notebook, the real one, the proof, in plain sight on the workbench, where a man coming to retrieve it would go straight to it. She did not have long to wait. It was full dark when she heard the cars. Not 1, 2, maybe 3 engines, low headlights off rolling slow up the dirt road that dead-ended at her door. She heard them stop. She heard doors. She heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel, more than one man moving careful, and she made herself stand still in the orange light by the anvil, with her heart slamming and her hands steady. The front door slid open. The man who came through it first was not what she expected, and she realized in the moment she saw him that she had been expecting hired muscle,
and that the fact that Roland Pierce had come himself in person into a forge in a dead town in the dark told her everything about how badly he wanted what he thought was waiting here, and how certain he was that an 18-year-old girl could not possibly be a threat. He was an older man, well past 60, silver-haired and expensively dressed even here, even now, with the kind of smooth, unbothered confidence of a man who had spent his whole life getting his way and had never once been made to answer for it. 2 men came in behind him, big and quiet, and one of them eased the front door shut. "Miss Ashe," Roland Pierce said. He smiled. It was a good smile. It had probably cut 100 ribbons. "I think you and I are long overdue for a conversation." "I know who you are," Marlowe said. "I'm sure you think you do." He looked around the shop, slow, almost fond, taking in the cleaned tools and the lit fire. And there was something genuinely wistful in it, the look of a man surveying a thing he had wanted for a very long time. 11 years, he said softly. "Your grandfather made me wait 11 years for this building. A stubborn old man. I respect stubbornness, you know. I do. But I respect it the way you respect a tree that's been in your way too long. You admire it right up until you cut it down. You killed my parents." She said it flat into the orange light, and she watched his face, and the thing that happened in it was the thing she'd come for. He did not look surprised. He did not look caught. He looked for one bare instant, pleased. Pleased that she knew, pleased to be admired for it. The small, terrible vanity of a man who had gotten away with a thing for 11 years and had never once been able to take credit. "Is that what the old man left you?" Pierce said. "A bedtime story." He glanced at the workbench, at the notebook lying there in plain sight, and his eyes sharpened. "Or did he leave you something more inconvenient than that?" "Why?" Marlowe said. "I just want to hear you say it. Why my mother? Why my father? They never did anything to you. They left this town. They didn't care about your block or your money. Why?" And Roland Pierce alone in a forge with a girl he intended to kill, with no one to hear but his own 2 men and a fire, Roland Pierce told her. "Because your grandfather wouldn't sell," he said simply, and there was no heat in it, no shame, nothing but the flat arithmetic of a man who'd done the sum a long time ago and never lost a night's sleep over it. "I offered him a fair price, more than fair. He had a worthless building in a dead town, and I offered him a fortune for it, and he told me to go to hell. Do you understand what that cost me? One holdout on a block I need, and the whole thing stalls, and the money I have to move through that property has nowhere to go. He was a problem. And a problem like that you don't argue with. You make the cost of saying no unbearable." He shrugged an awful simple gesture. His son and his daughter-in-law were the cost. I wanted him to understand that the next no
would cost him you. And he understood. He understood perfectly. He gave you up, and he kept his mouth shut for 11 years. And I'll tell you, Miss Ash, I genuinely thought that was the end of it. He sighed. And then the old fool died, and you came up here, and you started digging, and you couldn't leave it alone. Just like him. Stubborn. He looked at her almost kindly. It really does run in the blood. In the dark woods behind the shop, in the cab of Otis Marsh's truck, a state police investigator who had been listening to every word leaned forward toward a laptop screen and said very quietly into a radio, "That's it. That's enough. Move in." Marlo didn't know that yet. What she knew was that Roland Pierce had just confessed in his own voice to ordering the murder of her mother and father, and that the small, smashed-looking phone on the high shelf had caught every word of it, and that whatever happened to her in the next 60 seconds, it was already too late for him. So she told him. "There's a phone on that shelf," she said. "It's been recording since you walked in, and everything it's heard has been going to the state police live the whole time." For one long moment, Roland Pierce simply looked at her, and then the smooth confidence drained out of his face all at once, like heat out of cooling steel, and what was left underneath was the thing she'd wanted to see. Fear, real fear. The fear of a man who has felt the solid ground of 50 years go soft under his feet. "Find it," he snapped at his men. "Find the phone. Burn it. Burn the whole—" And that was when the woods lit up. Headlights, a dozen of them flooding through the cracked front door, and the dirty window and engines, and the crunch of many vehicles coming fast up the dirt road. And a voice through a loudspeaker hard and flat, ordering everyone inside to come out with their hands visible. Pierce's men bolted for the side door, and found it barred from the outside, where Dale had barred it an hour before. And beyond it, more lights, more men. There was shouting. There was the slam of doors and the crackle of radios. But there was no fight in the end, because there was nowhere to go, and nothing left to burn, and men like Pierce's men do not die for men like Pierce. It was over in minutes. Marlo stood by the anvil through all of it in the orange light with her grandfather's hammer in her hand, and she watched them take Roland Pierce out of her grandfather's shop in handcuffs. He didn't look smooth anymore. He didn't look like a man who cut ribbons. He looked old and gray and finished, and as they walked him past her toward the door, he stopped just for a second and looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him look away first. He'd wanted the building more than anything in the world. He had come to get it himself in the dark, and the building had been the thing that destroyed him. The forge her grandfather kept lit for 30 years. The proof her grandfather forged into steel and hid in plain sight.
The girl her grandfather had made a hammer for and waited over and never got to meet. The whole stubborn weight of the Ashe family had fallen on Roland Pierce, at last 11 years late, and it had crushed him flat. The investigations took months. Pierce's confession, caught clean on the recording, was the spine of it, but it was Silas Ashe's 11 years of patient work that gave it flesh, the notebook, the originals from the safe deposit box, the chain of companies traced all the way to the top. Dale's copied emails closed the circle. Marlowe gave her statements again and again in plain rooms with patient officers, and each time she told the whole story, start to finish, and each time it got a little easier to say out loud. Dale told the truth too. All of it, including his own part, the door he'd left open, the fire he'd let in. He didn't ask for mercy, and he got little, but the prosecutors noted in the end that he had turned, that he had copied the evidence at enormous risk, that he had driven it himself to the one set of police Pierce didn't own, and had handed them his own confession along with it. His father's debt, it turned out, had been built on the same crooked paper as half of Pierce's empire. And when that empire came apart, the debt came apart with it. It was not redemption. Marlowe was careful in her own heart never to call it that. But it was a man choosing finally not to bend, and she found she could not hate him for being the thing he'd been when she remembered the thing he'd chosen to become. Roland Pierce did not see the outside of a courtroom as a free man again. And Marlowe Ashe stayed in Stonebridge. She paid off the back taxes in full in cash at the county office, and the clerk who'd looked at her like she was a fool the first time looked at her differently now. She fixed the leak in the roof and replaced the cracked windows and scrubbed the smoke stain off the wall where the fire had been. She brought the building up to code, every line of it, so that no man could ever again use a stack of paper to threaten her out of her own home. She learned the trade, slowly, the hard way. She burned steel and bent it wrong, and hit her thumb more times than she could count, and made ugly, clumsy, honest things. And she did not give up, because giving up had never once been the thing that ran in her blood. She read the journal until she knew it by heart. She read the books until the diagrams made sense. And little by little, the ring of the hammer on the anvil became a familiar sound on Forge Road again. And people began to come first. Otis with a broken hinge, then Verna with a garden gate, then strangers from the next town over who'd heard there was a smith in Stonebridge again, a young one, a stubborn one, a girl. The town which had watched her arrive like a stray took her in. She was not the strange girl with the garbage bags anymore. She was Silas Ashe's granddaughter, and she was part of the long story of the place woven into it now, the way her grandfather had been, the way her father had been before that. Her first real project, the first thing she made, start to finish, that she was proud of, was a gate. It was the iron gate for the little cemetery at the edge of town, where her mother and father lay side by side, and where, in the empty space beside them,
she had finally laid her grandfather to rest with a proper stone. His name cut clean, Silas Ash. The old cemetery gate had been broken for years, hanging from one hinge, sagging into the weeds. Marlowe spent a week on it. She built the fire and heated the steel and hammered the scrollwork by hand, ruining piece after piece, starting over, ruining it again, until at last she forged a gate that was not perfect, but was strong and was true and would swing straight for 40 years, the way her grandfather's hinges had on Otis Marsh's barn. She said it like a frightened girl talking too much to the only person who'd been kind to her. The upstairs apartment became a home. She fixed it up slow as the work came in and the money allowed. She hung the photograph of her parents back on the bedroom wall in the exact spot where she'd found it, where her grandfather had kept it for 30 years. And sometimes, in the evening, with the forge banked low and the day's work done, she'd talk to them, to all three of them, telling them about a piece she was working on, about something funny Verna had said about the weather. The silence in the apartment didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full. It felt like family. Inheritance is a strange word. Marlowe had thought once that it meant money, property, things you were handed by people who died. The $75,000 Pierce had waved at her had looked for one desperate afternoon like the whole of what a person could inherit, but she knew better now. The money her grandfather left her had only ever been a tool, a way to start a way to buy time, a way to clear the taxes and fix the roof and keep her fed long enough to find out what she was really worth. The real inheritance was the rest of it, the trade, the shop, the fire she could light with her own two hands, the choice he'd given her in the end by leaving everything to a granddaughter he was forbidden to know, the choice to take the easy money and run, or to stay and dig and find the truth and stand up to the men
who'd buried her family and become the author of her own story instead of one more line in someone else's file.
He'd given her back her name, not a case number, not a ward of the state. Marlowe Ash, a Smith, a daughter, a granddaughter. The last of a stubborn line that did not break easy and did not burn away to nothing. The hammer with her name forged into the steel hung on the wall by the forge, and she used it every day, and it fit her hand like it had been made for it because it had. The sign above the front door still read Ash and Son. She'd thought about changing it. She'd stood out front one morning with a ladder and a can of paint, meaning to make it right, meaning to put her own name where it belonged. And then she'd climbed back down and put the paint away. Because the sign was the dream her father lost, and her grandfather kept lit, and there was no shame in it. And besides, she had her own way of telling the world who she was now. It rang out clear and bright over Forge Road. Every working day, the ring of a hammer on an anvil. The sound of a girl taking the hardest, coldest, most unforgiving thing there is, and with fire, and will and her own 2 hands, making it into something true. The fire was lit. After all those years, the fire was lit, and this time there was someone home to keep it.
I know who you are, Marlowe said. I'm sure you think you do.
He looked around the shop, slow, almost fond, taking in the cleaned tools and the lit fire. And there was something genuinely wistful in it, the look of a man surveying a thing he had wanted for a very long time. 11 years, he said softly. Your grandfather made me wait 11 years for this building. A stubborn old man. I respect stubbornness, you know. I do. But I respect it the way you respect a tree that's been in your way too long.
You admire it right up until you cut it down.
You killed my parents. She said it flat into the orange light, and she watched his face, and the thing that happened in it was the thing she'd come for. He did not look surprised. He did not look caught. He looked for one bare instant, pleased. Pleased that she knew. Pleased to be admired for it. The small, terrible vanity of a man who had gotten away with a thing for 11 years and had never once been able to take credit.
Is that what the old man left you? Pierce said. A bedtime story.
He glanced at the workbench at the notebook lying there in plain sight, and his eyes sharpened.
Or did he leave you something more inconvenient than that?
Why? Marlowe said. I just want to hear you say it. Why my mother? Why my father? They never did anything to you. They left this town. They didn't care about your block or your money. Why? And Roland Pierce, alone in a forge, with a girl he intended to kill, with no one to hear but his own 2 men, and a fire, Roland Pierce told her.
Because your grandfather wouldn't sell,
he said simply, and there was no heat in it, no shame, nothing but the flat arithmetic of a man who'd done the sum a long time ago and never lost a night's sleep over it.
I offered him a fair price, more than fair. He had a worthless building in a dead town, and I offered him a fortune for it, and he told me to go to hell. Do you understand what that costs me? 1 holdout on a block I need, and the whole thing stalls, and the money I have to move through that property has nowhere to go. He was a problem, and a problem like that you don't argue with. You make the cost of saying no unbearable. He shrugged an awful, simple gesture. His son and his daughter-in-law were the cost. I wanted him to understand that the next no would cost him you. And he understood. He understood perfectly. He gave you up, and he kept his mouth shut for 11 years. And I'll tell you, Miss Ash, I genuinely thought that was the end of it.
He sighed.
And then the old fool died, and you came up here, and you started digging, and you couldn't leave it alone. Just like him. Stubborn.
He looked at her almost kindly.
It really does run in the blood.
In the dark woods behind the shop, in the cab of Otis Marsh's truck, a state police investigator
who had been listening to every word, leaned forward toward a laptop screen and said very quietly into a radio, "That's it. That's enough. Move in." By daylight, the forge was less like a cathedral and more like a job. An enormous, filthy, decades-deep job. She found a stack of clean rags and a tin of oil on a shelf. "There's a phone on that shelf," she said. "It's been recording since you walked in, and everything it's heard has been going to the state police live the whole time." For one long moment, Roland Pierce simply looked at her, and then the smooth confidence drained out of his face all at once, like heat out of cooling steel, and what was left underneath was the thing she'd wanted to see. Fear, real fear. The fear of a man who has felt the solid ground of 50 years go soft under his feet.
"Find it," he snapped at his men. "Find the phone. Burn it. Burn the whole—"
And that was when the woods lit up, headlights, a dozen of them, flooding through the cracked front door and the dirty window and engines, and the crunch of many vehicles coming fast up the dirt road, and a voice through a loudspeaker, hard and flat, ordering everyone inside to come out with their hands visible. Pierce's men bolted for the side door and found it barred from the outside, where Dale had barred it an hour before, and beyond it, more lights, more men. There was shouting. There was the slam of doors and the crackle of radios. But there was no fight in the end, because there was nowhere to go and nothing left to burn, and men like Pierce's men do not die for men like Pierce. It was over in minutes. Marlowe stood by the anvil through all of it in the orange light with her grandfather's hammer in her hand, and she watched them take Roland Pierce out of her grandfather's shop in handcuffs. He didn't look smooth anymore. He didn't look like a man who cut ribbons. He looked old and gray and finished, and as they walked him past her toward the door, he stopped just for a second and looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him look away first. He'd wanted the building more than anything in the world. He had come to get it himself in the dark, and the building had been the thing that destroyed him. The forge her grandfather kept lit for 30 years. The proof her grandfather forged into steel and hid in plain sight. The girl her grandfather had made a hammer for and waited over and never got to meet. The whole stubborn weight of the Ashe family had fallen on Roland Pierce at last 11 years late, and it had crushed him flat. The investigations took months. Pierce's confession caught clean on the recording was the spine of it, but it was Silas Ashe's 11 years of patient work that gave it flesh. The notebook, the originals from the safe deposit box, the chain of companies traced all the way to the top. Dale's copied emails closed the circle. Marlowe gave her statements again and again in plain rooms with patient officers, and each time she told the whole story, start to finish, and each time it got a little easier to say out loud. Dale told the truth too. All of it, including his own part, the door he'd left open, the fire he'd let in. He didn't ask for mercy, and he got little, but the prosecutors noted in the end that he had turned, that he had copied the evidence at enormous risk, that he had driven it himself to the one set of police Pierce didn't own, and had handed them his own confession along with it. His father's debt, it turned out, had been built on the same crooked paper as half of Pierce's empire,
And when that empire came apart, the debt came apart with it. It was not redemption. Marlowe was careful in her own heart never to call it that. But it was a man choosing finally not to bend, and she found she could not hate him for being the thing he'd been when she remembered the thing he'd chosen to become. Roland Pierce did not see the outside of a courtroom as a free man again. And Marlowe Ashe stayed in Stonebridge. She paid off the back taxes in full in cash at the county office, and the clerk who'd looked at her like she was a fool the first time looked at her differently now. She fixed the leak in the roof and replaced the cracked windows and scrubbed the smoke stain off the wall where the fire had been. She brought the building up to code, every line of it, so that no man could ever again use a stack of paper to threaten her out of her own home. She learned the trade, slowly, the hard way. She burned steel and bent it wrong, and hit her thumb more times than she could count, and made ugly, clumsy, honest things. And she did not give up, because giving up had never once been the thing that ran in her blood. She read the journal until she knew it by heart. She read the books until the diagrams made sense. And little by little, the ring of the hammer on the anvil became a familiar sound on Forge Road again, and people began to come first. Otis with a broken hinge, then Verna with a garden gate, then strangers from the next town over who'd heard there was a smith in Stonebridge again, a young one, a stubborn one, a girl. The town, which had watched her arrive like a stray, took her in. She was not the strange girl with the garbage bags anymore. She was Silas Ashe's granddaughter, and she was part of the long story of the place woven into it now, the way her grandfather had been, the way her father had been before that. Her first real project, the first thing she made, start to finish, that she was proud of, was a gate. It was the iron gate for the little cemetery at the edge of town, where her mother and father lay side by side, and where in the empty space beside them she had finally laid her grandfather to rest with a proper stone. His name cut clean, Silas Ashe. The old cemetery gate had been broken for years, hanging from one hinge, sagging into the weeds. Marlowe spent a week on it. She built the fire and heated the steel and hammered the scroll work by hand, ruining piece after piece, starting over, ruining it again until at last she forged a gate that was not perfect, but was strong and was true and would swing straight for 40 years, the way her grandfather's hinges had on Otis Marsh's barn. Marlowe, I know what your name is. Verna pushed the bag across the counter. Everybody on this street knows what your name is. She looked Marlowe up and down, the dust in her hair. The upstairs apartment became a home. She fixed it up slow as the work came in and the money allowed. She hung the photograph of her parents back on the bedroom wall in the exact spot where she'd found it, where her grandfather had kept it for 30 years. And sometimes, in the evening, with the forge banked low and the day's work done, she'd talk to them, to all three of them, telling them about a piece she was working on, about something funny Verna had said about the weather. The silence in the apartment didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full. It felt like family. Inheritance is a strange word. Marlowe had thought once that it meant money, property, things you were handed by people who'd died. The $75,000 Pierce had waved at her had looked for one desperate afternoon like the whole of what a person could inherit. But she knew better now. The money her grandfather left her had only ever been a tool, a way to start, a way to buy time, a way to clear the taxes and fix the roof and keep her fed long enough to find out what she was really worth. The real inheritance was the rest of it. The trade, the shop, the fire she could light with her own two hands. The choice he'd given her in the end by leaving everything to a granddaughter he was forbidden to know. The choice to take the easy money and run, or to stay and dig and find the truth and stand up to the men who'd buried her family and become the author of her own story instead of one more line in someone else's file. He'd given her back her name, not a case number, not a ward of the state. Marlowe Ashe, a Smith, a daughter, a granddaughter. The last of a stubborn line that did not break easy and did not burn away to nothing. The hammer with her name forged into the steel hung on the wall by the forge, and she used it every day, and it fit her hand like it had been made for it, because it had. Behind her, as the door swung shut, a long silence. And the silence was not the same as the one she'd walked in on, because the sign was the dream her father lost and her grandfather kept lit, and there was no shame in it. And besides, she had her own way of telling the world who she was now. It rang out clear and bright over Forge Road every working day, the ring of a hammer on an anvil, the sound of a girl taking the hardest, coldest, most unforgiving thing there is, and with fire and will and her own two hands making it into something true. The fire was lit. After all those years, the fire was lit, and this time there was someone home to keep it.